And I was like, no, I mean, what they told you is what you have to.
Yeah, they kept looking for me to like add to what, like after you left, Sam, they kept looking at me to like add to what you were saying. I was like, test what Sam said. I don't have anything more to
I don't really
add.
feel like I said anything controversial.
So
I just was
either.
like, do a lot like adjustment.
Yeah,
You wanna
well,
check with the
But
staff?
yeah,
What, you guys are locked and loaded, ready to go here?
Wait. saying there's a planning and zoning meeting. And they're just mixing both things together.
No, there, I mean, I
That's
saw a
better.
post on Nextdoor that did a
Yeah,
good
that
job of
looks
stuff.
Across the hall, yeah.
Yeah,
That is confusing. I can
Yeah.
understand why
Yeah,
somebody
yeah,
might
makes
get
sense.
them.
I think it's fine. I mean, I actually think
Yeah,
Are we ready, guys?
Those conflicts of interest.
I'm
Okay.
gonna recuse myself for the entire meeting.
Okay, we'd like to welcome everyone to the July 11th, 2024 work session for the Cottonwood Heights City Planning Commission. We have one item that we're going to be working on in particular here tonight. It's something that's been in process just for the sake of the public, and we appreciate everybody's flexibility in adjusting to get this meeting on the schedule. So thank you to the commissioners for a little bit of pivots. We know that July is super busy for all of us, staff and volunteers. So thanks for everybody working towards that. So with that, we'll turn the time over to staff to go through these items. And
Yeah,
if you have had a chance to everybody to ask about these or any front loaded things that you'd like to see, or you want to just kind of go through the items as they present. You guys okay with this proceeding that way? Okay, let's do it.
okay, I'm just gonna pull up the PDF of the packet on the screen, and I found with these, that's the easiest way to show it rather than slides. I'll zoom in. And you guys will recall, I guess I don't recall exactly who was at the meeting in April, but we talked about this effort, which is related to yard elements. Back in April, it was April 3rd, and you guys gave some great feedback. Obviously, with other private development applications that came in, we had to kind of table this for a few meetings, but we're back. And we've provided an updated draft here that just responds to the feedback you guys gave. So I think what may be most efficient is if I walk us through the changes we made between April and now, and then if there's any additional discussion, we should have plenty of time. So I'm gonna just follow along in my packet where I've highlighted some of the ones that they changed. So the first one would be in the definition of gazebo, we updated it from occupiable to habitable to specify, because technically you can occupy a gazebo. What we were getting at is it's not habitable space. We made that minor word choice or word change there. And then a similar change on the playground and swing set, just again, habitable instead of occupiable. On raised beds and planters, we just clarified that this is referring to an above ground planting vessel that's just for decorative or gardening purposes. It's not structural. And by this definition, it's also not meant to be like a wall sorts. And then
Are we gonna wait and ask questions, or do you want me to ask questions?
to you, if you want to stop me at any point, did you have one on?
Yeah, so in these definitions, where one place we say habitation and the other place we say habitable space.
Oh, sure.
Do we have, I mean, does it matter that it's
Good to be consistent.
Yeah, I
So-
think, and I don't, I have no,
No preference either way.
I just think that we should say the same
Yeah.
thing.
Great comment to be parallel between them. When we update the draft for city council, we can choose 1/10 of the word or another. Okay, the next one that changed was swimming pool. So you may recall from our April meeting, we had two different definitions. One was kind of like for if you had a private pool in your yard, and then one was more geared around to recreation, like more public. And we, through that discussion, it was, the consensus was, let's just collapse it into one definition. If somebody were to be interested in like renting out their pool, they would have to go through the home business section of our code, which kind of already covers that. So to keep it more brief, we just collapsed the definitions into one and have that here. And then same thing on treehouse, changed that from occupiable to habitable. See, these are all pretty minor. And this is just the definition section. So the way the zoning ordinance works, 19.04 is just all the various definitions. So the whole thing I've been scrolling through so far is not necessarily the regulations themselves. This is just like the glossary, if you will. And then we get into, obviously the jump here is many chapters are not shown because we didn't make changes to them. But then we get into the actual regulatory language and wanted to bring to your attention a couple things on that. So the first one, and you'll see a lot of this is just unchanged. There's no track changes here or anything. And then we get, oh, I think, oh, screen dimmed. I was scrolling too fast. I thought it was flashing.
Sorry.
Too quick. Okay, no changes there. Try to go a little slower. Okay, so then we get down to this kind of miscellaneous section, and there was some discussion at the last meeting that we had this item about flagpole height and what should be allowed. Well, Ian did research on what other cities are doing. And we recommended an approach here similar to what Holiday does by just saying you can put a flagpole anywhere in your yard and it can be 10 feet taller than what a house can be in that zone or structure. There was a lot of different ways to do it, and a lot of them felt really unnecessarily complicated to have it be like different in each zone. We felt like this was a nice, even, neat way of doing it. And then as far as the retaining wall section goes, I struggled with this a little bit because there's so many different situations in which someone is using a wall or a fence. It's hard to write a code that covers all of that. And where I landed with doing it was saying, okay, here's the existing section on walls or fences for on a property line, which is usually what someone's building a wall or fence for. There's an exception to the height if you are building a wall or a fence that meets the setback standards for a building in that zone. So if somebody, for instance, was doing one that's just landscaping, just decorative, we have put in here, you can actually build that to the height of that structure in that zone if you meet the same setback as a structure, if you set it back from property lines. And that's how we interpret it today. But we felt it would be really helpful to codify that. So like an example I would give is, let's say somebody wanted to do kind of some terracing in their backyard. They wanted to put a retaining wall in, and they said, what's my height regulation? We would say, well, if you're on the property line, you've got to follow the fencing ordinances. But if you're setting it back from property lines, and meeting the setbacks for a structure, the height is more open-ended.
Doesn't the current wall and fence language have setback? Height increases at setback?
It does it has some language about terracing, but there was nothing in here about clarifying this. No, I think it was largely procedural. And so we just felt like it needed to be actually codified.
The existing language is good for governing fences and walls at property lines.
Right.
Between properties. It's not as good for the retaining wall that takes you from one level of your yard down to another.
What though, I mean, would that allow a side setback is what? 8 feet?
Yeah.
So at 8 feet, you could have a 30-foot wall.
That would be, yeah, I think we would, because we would say you could have a wall of a house.
Be 30.
Yeah, that was our rationale there is, or at 3 feet, you could have 14-foot wall because you could have a 14-foot shed. So we felt like the impact, you could have a wall of a building that tall at that distance. That was kind of our rationale. But still open to discussion if there's a different direction.
I think that I share that concern. I'm not quite sure how we remedy that, but I would add to that just with the back to the retaining wall circumstance that once you get one level, if it's underneath the 6 feet, right? For retaining walls, if they're doing it in stages, there's no engineering required as long as there's another, I mean, what's the?
There is engineering required if it's over 4 feet. And then by the engineering standards that we're held to, there is a certain ratio of rise over run.
Okay,
So for every, so many feet in height of the wall, the next terrace would have to be so many feet back. So we would follow that standard.
if they said it at 4 feet. Do you know what the calculation?
I
ends up
don't.
being?
I don't know.
It depends on the design of the wall, but basically what that prevents is you can't build like a 2-foot wall and then move a foot back and build another
Yes.
2-foot wall.
Yeah,
Consider them all separate 2-foot walls because it's a whole system acting as one retaining structure. So it's a
Okay.
building code, engineering code calculation of however tall one level is, you have to horizontally set that back a certain distance. It's
For-
usually 2 or 3 times how tall it is.
For it to be considered a separate
Before you
element.
start another wall for those to be considered separate. Otherwise, you could terrace, but it's considered one wall.
Okay, that's what I was after, because I'm observing one that I hope.
We did,
engineering happened for.
also specify in here that it is from existing grade, so you couldn't add in 10 feet of fill. And then say, I'm gonna build my wall on top of that, it's from the existing grade. And that's how we measure them today, but
It makes a lot of sense. It just,
it doesn't.
it kind of is difficult. We spent a long time on this
Yes,
problem before,
I've
but,
heard.
but you have an 8-foot fence and if you move it in 3 feet, suddenly it can be 30 feet tall.
14 feet if it's 3
14,
feet in. Yeah, because that would be the
Yeah.
accessory structure setback.
Just seems like 8 to,
I know what you mean.
seems like a pretty
I know what you
big move up
mean.
for 3 feet.
And then at the same time, it's like, but then we would allow the wall of the building.
Yeah, you could put a
And
building
so-
there. So I follow the thinking.
You
It's
know,
hard to argue.
This is
Yeah.
kind of our best go at it. It is fully possible that we say, we thought of a better idea and we're back. And that's why it comes to you guys, so that any recommendations you do want to make on the verbiage, we can take to the city council.
That
We'll say any-
freestanding wall issue, that, I mean, I wonder if we can differentiate between an enclosed structure and a freestanding wall. Is that unreasonable or?
You can differentiate. I think the point being, is
Why?
there a difference if you have a 14-foot shed
Yeah,
that's opaque 3 feet off the property line, but we don't allow a 14-foot fence 3 feet off the property line?
I have a hard time thinking of a good argument
Yeah.
against
Right,
that,
right.
so.
Well, I'm glad that we're all running in the same mental circle
Yeah.
that I was, because it was like, this feels different, and, it was a good exercise for me to wrestle with. So I think that may be the end of the parts I was gonna discuss. Oh, I did just specify in here that a permit is required. We have language in the building code that specifies when a permit is required for walls and fences, but I felt like it would be helpful to just put it in this section. Because this is often where people are looking anyway. So the rule today is that a permit is required for a wall over 4 feet in height and a fence over 6 feet in height. And
Is it also, like Mike was talking about the structure, like a series of retaining walls? Building permits also required, right?
yes,
So with that, I guess with that,
so if any of those, if you're terracing, if you do not follow the separation standard to where they're considered separate elements, we would take the cumulative height and say,
okay,
that's all one wall and it's over 4 feet and you need to get a permit. But
Okay.
if
Oh.
they, let's say
Okay.
they kept each tier to 4 feet and met the run between them, we would be like, okay, you don't need to. It's just about whether they meet that or not. And then the same thing is if someone stacks them. So sometimes we'll have a retaining wall and then a fence on top. And we say it's the cumulative height of the two. So if you have even if you have a 3-foot fence, if it's on top of a 4-foot wall, then you're now over. And there's existing language in here that I think was workshopped a lot during past councils
Thankfully.
to specify,
Yeah.
there's actually a
Remember.
conditional use permit process required for certain heights. So that remains unchanged. And then Mike, I think I'll turn it over to you to talk about 19.86.
Yeah, so we added one line. 19.86 is the historic structure ordinance. We have language elsewhere in the city code governing demolition approvals and permits for non-historic structures and for historic structures. So this line just cross-references what we have in the zoning ordinance with what's in Title 15 of the code. So they are now linked together. There's reference in Title 15 to Title 19. We just didn't have the vice versa
And it
reference from 19 to 15.
may be good to clarify when you say it's about approval, like it just outlines that you can't demo something without going through the process.
It outlines
Is
the
that
process
correct?
for, in Title 19 for modifying or removing historic structures. In Title 15, the process for demolishing any building in the city. And it lays out the different procedures involved with that. So now this language just bridges those two ordinances together.
and it is historic defined?
Yeah, there's definitions for.
I couldn't
for all
remember.
things.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't know the code.
In Title 19, it actually says what structures in the city are considered historic structures.
Oh, got it, okay.
It can be nice to put some of the redundancy between the chapters, because if you're looking at one, you might not know the other exists. So
Great idea.
this is kind of a jump to type thing.
This is a long walk from your little addition, but demolition permit, what are the requirements? And obviously there is a particular historic structure that comes to mind
Sure.
quickly in this conversation.
Certainly.
What are the requirements for a demolition permit of a historic
So
structure?
right now, I can give a quick summary of both what's in Title 19 existing and what's in that Title 15 element. In Title 19, it says if a building is listed as a historic structure in the city, if you're modifying the historic intent of it, which would be changing the use, removing it, changing it really substantially in any way, it requires a conditional use permit. And it requires a public input process not to be less than 12 months. So a 12-month public input process, basically, before a conditional use permit can be issued to modify a historic building.
On what grounds could it be denied, though? I mean,
I was
the
the
public can
conditional
say,
use, it just says it's conditional use, so that it would have to go through, demonstrating the, the historic value of the site and how you're maintaining that, and it's all spelled out in there. I can open it.
It may be good to just clarify again, especially for anyone listening. The change we're showing here is not modifying what those requirements are at all. We're just referencing the other
Yeah.
chapter. So I do want to clarify, we're not making any changes to the provisions. We're just trying to cross-reference both everywhere.
and 1515 has not been modified recently.
I
1515,
not modified it. I'm not sure if at the council level it has been.
that was adopted fairly recently by the council, in May.
So recent, this is pretty recent.
And what that says, that establishes, hey, if you're demolishing any structure in the city, you need to get a demolition permit. If you don't, you're subject to these penalties. It's
The
just
criminal side
work
of it.
without a permit. If it's a historic structure, it's approved by the city council. It's called a certificate of appropriateness to demolish a historic structure on top of the conditional use permit, the 12-month process required by the planning commission.
I can also hold down this, but we don't have to keep this up, but were there any additional discussion or questions on those yard element changes? I'm happy to work it in.
I want to first separate on retaining walls, but we're a city of hills, and so this is an ongoing thing. Just with the last couple of projects we've had going down Fort Union Boulevard, some of those retaining situations, and even looking at Dover Hill, will any of these changes have any measurable? Would they have had any measurable effect on those projects?
I don't believe so.
Can't say 100% confidently, no, but for instance, Dover Hill was an existing hill that was a cut of a hillside. So that wall doesn't get actually any taller from existing grade because it's all of
A cut.
filling in a cut.
Mhm.
And our limitations on height are based on basically filling in, creating grade where it didn't exist before, rather than cutting into grade and retaining it.
Okay,
So in that case, no changes. This is trying to codify in practice how we administer this code already.
so for in that example, full engineering studies because of the height of
Yeah,
that
yeah.
wall.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that remains unchanged. I think if anything, there's more clarification on that because it does say you've got to get a permit, which gives us a point to look at it and
Okay.
say do engineering.
Nice. Okay.
So I think I guess you never know how one thing will impact another,
Yeah,
certainly, but I don't think that would have had a lot of bearing on those projects.
any of the issues that we ran into with individual lots with Giverny that you can think of that lessons that were learned from any of those that we should consider?
I think it's
And I'm not straining at extremities
Yeah.
because I can think of dozens, if not 100 lots that would have those type of slopes.
I think that some of the lessons learned for me was there needs to be more clarity in this chapter because we get a lot of questions about what's allowed. So yeah, certainly from taking those calls and working with code enforcement on walls that were illegally built in that development and in others all over the city, I do think impacted us trying to be really clear and spell it out, but.
I think this helps a lot with enforcement, because where we see the most issues are when these things get built, not following the process they're supposed to follow. So having clear language in to to hand to an enforcement officer to say, hey, you need to follow this process with your wall. Clarifying that as much as possible helps us out. The people that call in ahead of time and say, I want to do this, what steps do I need to take? We have a pretty good handle on those, so we see issues most commonly with, landscaping crews that will come in after the fact and put in retaining walls and fences all over the place and do things that should have gotten a permit but didn't, and then it becomes an enforcement situation.
Are we having that come up very often?
Yeah, it's kind of.
I mean,
control.
yeah, I mean, as fairly regular where you
Okay.
see, construction without permits, I'd say as a broad category is pretty common in the city.
I also
I'm glad
think-
we're enforcing that.
I think that fencing is a unique issue because fencing, where fences exist are not always where property lines are.
Mhm.
And so it's like informally, a fence has been here for X number of years and people assume that's where the property line is.
Yeah.
But that doesn't always reflect it. So I think it's just kind of a common issue in every city. Because if you are dealing with an actual property line and proximity to that, more than you would be with most other types of development. It's right on that line between two properties, so I think we're likely to continue to have. People who don't follow it, and this gives us a little bit more ability to hand them like, hey, this is what you need to do to bring it into compliance.
Great.
Cool, any other comments or questions from the commission? All right,
We okay on flagpoles?
Sounds good to me.
Anywhere in the yard, 10 feet over?
Most places in
Anywhere?
the city, that's 45 feet. That's what that means in most zones.
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry, anywhere in the yard,
It says anywhere in the yard.
yeah,
so
we-
right next to on the property line, you could.
we didn't really feel that it needed to be restricted because it's such a narrow thing, but certainly up for discussion. That's why we bring it through, yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Not issue, but
like I said, we modeled it after holidays.
Yeah, holidays was 8 feet.
Oh,
Seems kind of arbitrary. Some other cities were like, what was it? Mill Creek was 14 feet.
Yeah,
But it
It varied.
differed depending on the zone, so.
Mike, are you hesitating?
But a setback
Position,
might be
like
interesting,
location.
might,
well, I'm just,
maybe to be in the building envelope.
or, I mean, I think it's also, we always just say you gotta build on your property. Don't put it on the property line, don't put it on your neighbors, but it's one of those items where we certainly don't wanna overregulate it if it's just kind of someone's, freedom of speech and also a pretty typically like narrow thing that's not a visual obstruction, but totally up for discussion.
I don't have an issue with that. I just think
It's a great
it's
question.
possible that some neighbors might have a little
Sure.
antagonism toward each other.
These standards the accessory building standard, that's a 3-foot setback usually, that could be something you model it after. The sign code it only applies to commercial properties, but usually that's a setback of like 18 inches to 2 feet, just enough to get it off the property line.
It also
So,
could be a benefit for the situation I'm thinking of now that you've brought that up, is if somebody puts it right on their front property line, could that create any sort of like clear view issues for someone backing out? I mean, it's such a narrow thing again, but at a certain perspective perhaps, so you could say maybe 3 feet off all property lines.
As far as like visibility of a flagpole goes, that high, 3 feet wouldn't really have much of an impact.
That's
but
a good point.
If it's like a hazard, it could be something you could consider.
Totally valid.
So can you put anything you want on a flagpole?
I don't
Can
feel
your
equipped
flag
to
say
answer
whatever
that
you want?
question. I don't
I
think
mean-
that's a planning question I can answer.
It's a sign content issue, right?
That's the
You're
question.
regulating time, place and manner. You're not regulating content. So you can regulate how tall and where that flagpole is located and, if it has lights on it, when it has to turn off, but you can't necessarily regulate what
I
it.
think that's a question for a freedom of speech attorney that I can't answer.
It's interesting though, if related to the sign language, you could put any commercial sign. And if you mount it just to a flagpole, suddenly it's permitted.
Sure.
I will say today, if someone calls and says, can I build a flagpole? What's the standards? We say we don't have any.
Yeah.
So I also don't know how much of an implication this will be,
Yeah.
given that today there's not a requirement for any regulation. We just do get the question, so we wanted to have an answer that was somewhere in code.
Well, I think this is the time if we feel like we want to have a setback,
Sure,
let's, I mean, I'm not opposed to saying 3 feet from the property line.
I mean, even if you know, for you guys to decide, but even if that's just like, there's merit in mitigating tense feelings between neighbors, that.
Right, because if it's on the property line and the flag is waving, it could be hanging
It's over.
over,
Sure.
it's over the line and even, I'm not even sure 3 feet would
Yeah, that's a really good point.
correct that,
Well, the
but
construction of it could, you know, if you're doing it right on the property line, it could involve some disturbance on the neighbor's property, so 3 feet seems reasonable.
I'm.
Anecdotally, I don't ever remember a zoning complaint about a flagpole,
Yeah,
so take that for what you will, but,
Maybe we can add 3 feet to it, but I mean, I don't, again, I'm not perceiving that we have a lot of malicious flag waving going on here, so.
There's some potential.
Not that we couldn't, I mean, you know, it's only July, so.
Well, it is a patriotic month. It's been fun to see everyone flying flags this month. So just if a motion is made in this meeting or in the next meeting, that's something that you may wanna
Yeah.
consider adding into a motion. I do have, thinking I have motion language, but if I don't, I can pull it up.
I think there is.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's
So
probably,
if we say it's okay to put it on the property line, later on, somebody has a problem with that, how difficult is it to go back and revise
I
this?
would recommend that if it's something the commission feels is valid now, do it while we're there.
Right.
Because it's,
If-
the question then becomes, is it something they have to initiate as an applicant and apply for, which is totally different thing than us saying this is city initiated for bringing it, so no permit required. for
we're
flags.
just saying you have to meet the standards. So it's enforceable, it's not a permit required.
And the size of the flag, is there any
Don't
discussion?
regulate
about
that either.
I'm all for not regulating.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna anticipate the problem.
I mean,
Don't,
If you put two flagpoles together and string something between them, they're still flags, but it's a billboard.
starting a new signage company.
Yeah, I got something going
We're
here.
gonna have a
Sounds
chat.
like a business.
These are really great questions, and I think we butt up against this issue every time we change the code, and it's, how do you write something that covers every situation, and
And you
you
don't.
can't?
Yeah.
And it's really hard as planners because we want to, we wanna have the foresight to be like, this is perfect and it's gonna work for everything, but all we can do is these little iterative changes and try to be 1% better each time we change the code and more clear, and appreciate the commission's support as we potentially bore you with these administrative changes, so.
to your question, Commissioner Smith, if, say we adopted an ordinance with no setback, and then for some reason we had a bunch of issues with flagpoles being on property lines, those would be established as being allowed to stay. We could change the ordinance further, which would then resolve that issue moving forward. But the ones approved would be allowed to stay.
Great, that's good clarification, and yeah, non-conforming,
Yeah.
which is always tricky, so.
Yeah.
At this point, I'd say that we'll probably solve future problems if you just put a setback back in now.
Yeah.
Right.
I think
Yeah,
that's a good
I
call.
agree.
And, you know, why cover it? Because now we've got people that got in before that and they're okay, and then people are upset because, I've got to do setback.
Yes, I think that's
So
good
I think you
foresight.
gotta just do it first.
That's why we bring it to you guys. You guys catch good stuff, so the process is working. Great, that is, I think, everything I had on this item. It's also our only item on the business session and thereby on our work session. I think up to the chair on how you want to use the rest of the time, but I think in other situations, we've also answered questions from the commission about other city projects, so
Yeah,
I'll turn it back to you.
no, I think that's a great idea for us to use it. I think there are a few things that, you know, some updates may be helpful.
Sure. Yeah, do you want me to offer some, or do you have any in mind?
Do you guys have anything, do you want updates on town center? Do you want updates on other things that are happening? Town center, I'll start and you finish and correct. The work of the advisory committee is coming towards a close, other than the communication portion. We narrowed it down to a couple of options that went to the CDRA, and in full transparency, we were all very comfortable with both options, and the primary feature continues to be 20% open space. Trying to maximize the views, making sure that it has the economic possibility to really be a generator for the city. And the mayor's pointed out a couple times that there are very, very few ways that a city can raise revenue outside of property taxes. and sales tax. And so trying to have something that would be a potential generator into the future may require a little bit more of a heavy lift. So there is a discussion of a bond that more details to follow. And that will be something we're considering as a city. We were universally in support of this for the sake of the long term. But it does mean that everybody gets to shoulder part of the load in order for us to get it done. So it'll be interesting as the public gets to see the iterations of the project, but it includes parking that's tucked away, not a lot of surface parking. The possibility of some, if we were able to get the tenant, a small grocer, an open space that could have a performing arts, outdoor performing arts space for maybe 100 people. A street that went through the middle of it that could be shut down in the right circumstance for walkability or, farmers markets or like a winter market. An area that, I mean, hypothetically, you could have like an outdoor skating rink in the winter time if you wanted. A little bit of residential, not very much.
Got it on the screen now too.
Oh, there you go. Oh, thank you. Thank you. So, and a lot of these structures were not defined because we're not dictating use for everything. We have some ideas about what we thought would be awesome, but that will depend on developers and tenants. There's a little triangle there, like a little kind of like a marquee in the dead center there, kind of a clock tower and lots of sitting spaces where you can observe the views of like the 5 different mountain peaks that you can see from the property and trying to preserve those. Probably some rooftop dining at some point. Lots of walkability, lots of bikeability to get in and around it. So yeah.
Can just scroll through these. This will all be posted on the project website, and as Dan referenced, the council's given direction to explore putting a general obligation bond on the ballot to help with some of the public financing necessary for the public parking and the public space and trying to implement this vision. So probably around Butlerville days, you'll see the city make its big kind of public education push on the bond and the messaging and what it is and what it means for everybody.
There's another piece just as while you're moving around there.
That one
On
helps.
23rd East, there's a piece of property that I think from Commissioner Shelton's days, they were looking at for a city hall. And it had been tied up in court for, decades, to my understanding. And we understand that there is movement on that property is no longer tied up in court. And it is a hope of the property owner to put high density housing in that area, which is adjacent to where we already have an apartment building. And that seems well located and well suited if that were to come to pass.
So that corner of 23rd East and Fort Union, I thought where Walgreens, was it Walgreens?
Correct.
there?
What the parcel he's
that's
talking
here.
about is the vacant one across from the post office.
On the east side of the street on 23rd East, just
Behind
south
the
of
car wash
apartments.
Yeah.
and below the power station, behind the Einstein Brothers Bagels, kind of tucked back in there.
A large parcel back there that's, I think, was originally anticipated as a future phase of Hill Rise.
So, right, the public.
And then for various legal reasons didn't move forward and it's been vacant. So that would be part of our form-based code area as well. So any development on that site would kind of be under that new purview, which would be interesting.
So Walgreens doesn't own that property.
Correct.
They've agreed to sell it.
We're
thought they were
working,
not giving that
we're
up.
working on it.
Two different properties, yeah. So the water.
There's a lot of moving pieces, so that's undecided yet.
I just thought that one
You're right.
corner was tied up.
Yes, a different sets of tied up, yes.
Okay.
So a lot more information to come on this. You'll see this information everywhere in newsletters and social media and out there, because
Yeah.
I was talking about a bond initiative is a big community thing, so there'll be a lot of information to come on that.
Any thoughts or what's your reaction just as you look at that?
I like the idea of having some kind of a place where you can have some musical events.
Mhm.
I went to South Pacific thing down in Murray Park a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if anybody watched that. I had a friend playing the trombone in that. It's just a nice,
Yeah.
nice evening to do that. And, you know, that's a little bigger area, I think, than what we're talking about with this, but smaller, it would be nice to have.
Yeah.
I'm not a fan of the street running through it.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I just feel like that kind of diminishes from the walkability
Mhm.
of it, from it being a real community kind of thing.
A bike path would be okay?
The idea is it's a, you know, the committee talked a lot about this and I would encourage you all to watch the CDRA work session from a couple weeks ago, because they
July
talked about it
2nd.
at length.
Okay.
But the idea is you have, you know, ground floor retail, commercial uses, the space is activated. The sidewalk space is really wide, you know, the street itself is not a typical city street, it's, you know, pavers or, you know, some sort of material where cars are allowed in there, but they're not necessarily the priority.
The main thoroughfare you would take as a car to move through
Okay.
the intersection, which I think is good, important.
And these, what you're seeing, these renderings, the pink doesn't indicate that's what it's gonna look like. That just, it signifies first floor versus second floor, like just, that's
Yeah.
really just to show you heights.
Good.
So I mean, how did the MGB, how'd they describe our community, like a mountain,
Yeah, it's like
Rustic.
suburban mountain. or
yeah, suburban
something like
mountain
that.
modern or something like that? I mean, as they kind of showed us what they meant by that, it kind of resonated. It's a little bit like Deer Valley, but maybe down a notch or two in terms of just, you know, a little more accessible.
It's a really good
But-
distinguishment to make that these are not architectural renderings. So I think it can be really alarming when you look at it and you're like, where are the windows? This is a blank face of wall. But it's just like a massing rendering to kind of show general massing of buildings. So it will be really fun to hopefully be at a point sometime in the future with the beautiful architectural detail, but that's a great point to make.
I think it's very exciting. It's
Mhm.
great.
And the other thing with the road was that the retailers are gonna be very concerned about the distance from their units to being able to drive up, and we're still gonna stretch at that. Because some of them, it's gonna be, their deliveries will have to be out on 23rd East or on Fort Union Boulevard at odd hours so that we don't disrupt it. So that's not the main reason to have the road going through, but there are a lot of reasons to kind of activate the center a little bit. But I had that same concern, but I mean, I'm not gonna promote jaywalking, but I'm anticipating people are gonna be zigzagging through that will never be a fast way to cut through. And that we could put bollards at any point, you know, I mean, if we've got farmers markets going and, you know, a movie in the park or whatever, I mean, all sorts of activities that could be going on multiple nights a week. People may just realize it's closed more than it's not, in my mind.
Flexibility is nice. What other projects do you guys have questions on? Or I can rapid
Maybe good to
fire.
clarify, 'cause I'm guessing some people are in the audience for this, the old mill. We've received a lot of comments, I think the commission's received a few, the city council has, about the future development of the old mill. We won't be talking about it, it's not an agenda item for planning commission tonight, but there is an event being hosted across the hall in the community room at 6:30. That's not a city affiliated hearing, that's not anything that the city has sponsored, but the owner of the old mill has scheduled that room, rented the room out, and is hosting a community open house to talk with residents and get input on that. So I just want to make that distinction, in case we get some comments on the old mill tonight, if there's any confusion. 6:30 is that open house across the hall. You know, it's not an agenda item on our agenda, obviously.
Great.
They are also similar to the concept presentation they made to the planning commission in June. I'm going to have 20 or 30 minutes next week with the city council. So they'll be able to introduce project ideas to the city council as well, next week.
So that'll be the
The
16th.
16th, yep, Tuesday. the
July.
16th.
There's a note in their time frame for the old mill for the gravel pit for something in August. And obviously, we're shifting timeframes based on their community meeting. Is there any new information on the gravel pit?
No, the gravel pit, no, especially the large
the large,
gravel pit
yeah.
portion. I haven't heard any updates
Okay.
on that or a request to present to the commission. I do recall when they were in at the last planning commission meeting, talking about the old mill. They had stated they'd like to come back to a planning commission work session after they host some of their community open houses. So we don't have a date tied down for that, but I would anticipate that in
Would be
August,
September.
September, sometime. So that'll come back to you. And this is all, again, pre-application level discussion before they actually formally apply for anything.
Okay. Other projects? Form-based code, seemed like it was pretty well received by the city council.
Yeah, that got introduced to council in the work session. It'll go back now, for public input and consideration. Probably in the next couple of months.
We have made some progress on the bike lane project.
Great.
for Union.
Excellent.
So you may recall, we have those two, like townhome developments that were built around 2019, on Port Union, around 17th East and Brook Hill. And the developer of each was required to put in a bike lane as part of their development, and then there was a gap between the two of them without that. So we received grant funding to connect the gap, build a bike lane, and it's been a very long process due to some funding issues, COVID, lots of different things, but we now actually have, as of today, we closed on acquiring some property to build it. So we had willing sellers, and there's still some final details to finish before we start construction on that, but we now have access to all 4 properties with those owners. So that has been exciting, and we have a construction meeting each week, so we'll be updating each owner as we get closer so they know what to expect, but we think maybe a month still until we break ground there, so. So a little bit more connectivity bit by bit, and then the Public Works Department is doing a sidewalk project that we bid together. So sidewalk is coming in on 17th East, almost all the way up to 7200, is that right?
Yeah, that'll complete that whole connection from Fort Union to 7200.
Wow.
Consistent sidewalk.
There's no construction in that
They're
neighborhood.
in the middle of it.
Love it when
Yeah.
we have
Yes, they-
sidewalks.
Dug up right now.
They've started that. We bid them together to save costs on construction, but we started with that portion while we finished acquisition. So that's been going on. And then we're also wrapping up the Canal Trail feasibility study, the East Jordan Canal Trail. There's that existing really small section of it behind Mount View Park. The council directed us to do a feasibility study to look at different options for extending that. So we've been working with a consultant for the past 9 months to do that. That's wrapping up right now. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of that process. Some feasibility studies just stay as a feasibility study. It doesn't move forward with construction, but if it's something that is prioritized by the council, I think it'll be a helpful effort to guide any future construction. So yeah, we're kind of wrapping up a couple of long-term projects right now. And then, should I talk about Canyon Center Park?
Yeah.
Yeah, so, up at Canyon Center by, the Marriott Hotel, there, in the master plan, there has been an arrangement for using some of the tax increment
Yes.
from those developments. This is like a fun game of
Let's
back
see
and
if you
forth.
know. Let's see.
Obviously, I'm not the economic development girl. Using the tax increment to build a city park in that development, and we've been waiting for the funds to accrue over the course of those projects being built. And we now are able to move forward with designing that small park. It's about 1 acre, it's pretty small. But we've selected a consultant and have just kicked off that process. So it'll be the park area, it's owned by the city, by the redevelopment agency. And it's right in front of the Marriott Hotel. So it's, if you drive by today, there's sort of a patch of dirt right south of the Marriott, and we've had some issues with people parking on it. But that will someday be a beautiful park. So I think Mike's gonna pull up, yeah, right here, the yellow kind of hook shape is where that park will be. So
That's great.
yeah, fun project there. Again, it's small, so it's not gonna have, we don't have the ability to program it with a ton of amenities, but just even having more public green space is hard to come by in a built out city. And so
It was originally slated to be an amphitheater, right?
Yes, that
But
was on
not
the
any
plan.
longer the plan?
I believe that with the focus on performing arts at the town center, we're not prioritizing that for this park. But we are just barely kicking off the process with our consultant for that. And so there will be a public process where different options are presented to say like, we can't fit everything on this tiny little parcel. What's the priority?
One advantage you have on that tiny little parcel is lots of parking.
Sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's been something we've discussed. I come through the development agreement and we have right to a good chunk of parking in that area. And so the good news is we don't have to eat up park space with more parking. So
Is there any movement from the projects, the other building projects on that, the two big pieces?
yeah, we've got the apartments.
Yeah,
On either side of our park?
so that parcel there on the west is entitled as an apartment building.
Mhm.
I think some of you were on the commission when that came through. And then this is on top of the parking structure. That was entitled originally as an office building. I think I've reported before, they are pursuing an amendment to the original development agreements. Not for the apartments, that, from what we've been told, is a construction lending interest rate waiting game. So when the rates hit a certain point, they'll pull the trigger on that and submit permits.
The office market changed a lot post-COVID. And so for that piece that Mike has highlighted now, building a bunch of new office right now is different than it was in 2010 when this.
Yeah, so what they need to do, what they're proposing informally still is make a formal request of the city council, the CDRA, to amend the development agreement to allow a different use there. And they're pursuing a condominium, for sale residential use there. But then they also have to go modify the agreements we have with each of the taxing entities that have invested into this project based on the expectation of an office building. So I know they've approached some of the taxing entities. They've not made a formal proposal to the CDRA, but that will need to happen soon because they have some deadlines coming up that they need to meet.
Could I ask a question about, so the decision the planning commission made to approve the consolidation of the 3 lots of
Yes.
Golden Hills Canyon was appealed.
Yes,
And I haven't looked recently, I'm sorry, to see what the decision was.
so we got the written decision today, this afternoon.
Oh.
The appeal was denied, meaning the commission's original decision was upheld.
Okay.
So the lot consolidation approval stands and presumably will move forward. But we just got that written decision 3 hours ago.
It's
Oh,
a
interesting.
really
Okay.
longer wait than I anticipated.
Yeah, because I mean, I attended the hearing and I thought it sounded like that it was gonna be maybe within 2 weeks. or
Yeah,
something.
so we just got that, but yeah, the appeal was denied.
Decision was upheld.
Thank you.
How many projects do we have going on?
The Hawk Signal, I don't know if you've seen that on Fort Union
Oh, yeah.
Boulevard by Bella Vista, that's going in now, that's the pedestrian only, signalized crosswalk that actually legally makes traffic stop to be able to cross safely there. That will be it's on schedule still, I believe, by the time school starts.
Correct. Yeah, and there's some lane closures right now for it. So it's always hard when there's, things that are doing good for the community, but there's the impact during construction. So
It's worth it.
lots going on right now with Public Works Department.
And there's discussion, there's interest by some parties about trying to do, if the signal works out well, that maybe around town center, that potentially one somewhere up Fort Union or on 23rd, that might be a useful tool too, so.
There's some regulations on how close one can be to a traffic signal, and so that's sometimes what the issue can be, where there's a certain distance it has to be from an intersection, and so it'll be interesting to see if that works
Mhm.
with Fort Union. But because it does legally hold traffic, it does affect the timing of other traffic lights. All right,
Okay. Anything else?
Great updates. Thanks.
yes.
All right, waiting for one more motion here.
I move that we adjourn.
Okay.
Second?
Motion second, all in favor of adjourn?
Aye.
Aye, we're adjourned. We'll see you back for the business session, 6 p.m.
Right, it's gonna be a little.